The groove in the desk was deep enough to fit a thumbnail sideways. Dr. Sira Valk noticed it the way she noticed everything now, with the sick, instant recognition of a woman who had lived this moment 1,447 times. Her fingernail found the groove without looking, the same way her left hand found the coffee mug, the same way her eyes tracked to the viewport where Kessler Station's twin suns were just cresting the gas giant's rings in a wash of gold and rose light. Beautiful. It was always beautiful. That had stopped mattering around iteration 300. The anomaly klaxon sounded, right on schedule. 4 minutes and 11 seconds from now, everything would reset. She stood, crossed the 7 steps to the monitoring console, and read the display she had memorized lifetimes ago. Temporal coherence fault local spacetime deviation 0.0044C. The numbers were always the same. The fault was always the same. The 4 minutes and 11 seconds were always exactly 4 minutes and 11 seconds, not a femtosecond more or less, as if whatever was wrong with this pocket of the universe had been measured and cut with surgical precision. Sira pulled her chair back to the desk and dragged her fingernail across the groove. One more mark, 1,448. The groove was the only thing that carried over. She had tested that exhaustively across the first 200 iterations. Notes she left on her datapad erased. Messages she sent to colleagues unsent. Physical objects she moved returned. The station's logs recorded nothing. To every instrument, every system, every living being aboard Kessler Station, the 4 minutes and 11 seconds between 07:14, 00 and 07:18, 11 had never happened. The universe simply folded back on itself like a crease in paper, and everything landed exactly where it had been. Everything except the groove, and everything except Sira's memory. She had theories about both. The groove persisted because it was a subatomic alteration, material displaced by friction, not by information. The anomaly reset information states but could not unscratch metal. It was a loophole in the mechanics of temporal reversion, the kind of detail that made her want to write a paper, except no paper survived the reset. Her memory persisted because she had been standing inside the fault cone when it first activated. Iteration 1. She had been calibrating the station's Karev-modified tachyon array, hands inside an open panel when the local spacetime had cracked like a sheet of ice under a boot. The crack had passed through her, and now she was what? Entangled with it, threaded into it. She was part of the fault, the way a knot is part of a rope. The klaxon pulsed again, 3 minutes 40 seconds remaining. Sira walked to the observation deck. The Thessari research team was there, as they were always there at 07:14, 30, 3 tall figures with chitinous plating the color of old copper, their compound eyes catching the twin sun light in fractal refractions. Dr. Keth Soranes, the lead Thessari temporal physicist, was speaking to the 2 junior researchers in that clicking, harmonic language that Sira had learned to understand around iteration 400. The calibration variance is within acceptable parameters, Keth was saying. We should see stable field coherence for the next solar quarter. Sira had heard this sentence 1,447 times. She could reproduce it in the original Thessari clicking dialect, accent perfect, with the exact rising harmonic on the word for coherence that marked Keth's regional origin. She had spent 200 iterations studying Thessari linguistics out of a desperate need to do something, anything, constructive with the time. Keth, she said. The Thessari turned. Compound eyes refracted her image into 1,000 tiny Siras. Dr. Valk, you appear distressed. I need you to listen to me very carefully. In approximately 3 minutes, the tachyon array is going to generate a localized temporal recursion. Everything within a 400-meter radius of the array core will be reset to its state at 07:14, 00. You will not remember this conversation. You will not remember any of the 1,447 previous conversations I have had with you that were identical to this one. Keth's mandibles clicked, a gesture Sierra had learned meant confusion mixed with professional skepticism. She had cataloged 43 distinct mandible configurations across the iterations, each corresponding to a different shade of Thessari emotional response. This one was configuration 7, respectful disbelief. That would require a coherence fault of a magnitude this station's array cannot. 0.0044C, Sierra said. That is the deviation. It registers on console 7, monitor 3, for exactly 1.8 seconds before the reset. The fault cone extends from the array core to the outer ring of Lab 12. Everything inside the cone reverts. Everything outside the cone never knows anything happened. Keth's mandibles stopped clicking. The two junior researchers, Voss and Terlian, both in their first solar year of posting, both still awed by the twin-sun view that Sierra had long stopped seeing, shifted on their leg joints, exchanging a look that, in Thessari body language, translated roughly to she is either brilliant or she has lost her mind. You know the deviation constant, Keth said slowly. I know everything that happens in the next 2 minutes and 50 seconds. Watch. Sierra pointed at the viewport. In 4 seconds, the docking alert for Transport Shuttle Karev 9 will sound. 3 seconds after that, Dr. Polani will come from Lab 6 asking about an inconsistency in the calibration log, a 0.03% discrepancy in field harmonic 12. She will use the word anomalous twice in the first sentence. The docking alert chimed. Keth flinched, mandible configuration 19 involuntary startle. 3 seconds later the comm crackled. Keth, this is Polani. I am seeing an anomalous 0.03% discrepancy in field harmonic 12, anomalous even by our baseline drift margin. Can you? Sierra reached over and muted the comm. She asks that question every time. She never gets an answer because the reset hits before you can finish responding. In iteration 812, I let the conversation play out fully. You get as far as asking her to rerun the harmonic analysis before the snapback takes you mid-word. Keth stood very still. The copper plating along the Thessari's thorax shifted, a ripple Sierra recognized as the species' autonomic stress response, the equivalent of a human's hair standing on end. In 1,447 iterations, Sierra had gotten better at reading Thessari physiology than most Thessari diplomats. She knew the exact rate at which Keth's stress ripple propagated across the thorax plates, 3.2 seconds from sternum to dorsal ridge, and she knew that the propagation speed increased by approximately 4% when the information being processed was not merely surprising but existentially dislocating. The ripple took 3.3 seconds this time, faster than baseline. Keth was listening. How long, Keth said quietly, have you been inside this loop? I stopped measuring in hours around iteration 200. In total elapsed subjective time, roughly 400 days. 400 days of the same 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Sierra paused. She had learned across the iterations exactly how much silence Keth needed to process large revelations. 7 seconds for conceptual surprises, 12 for existential ones. She counted to 12 in her head and then continued. I have spent those 400 days doing 3 things: mapping the anomaly, trying to break the anomaly. And she gestured at the groove, visible through the open doorway of Lab 4, keeping count. Keth made a sound that did not translate into any human language, a subsonic click followed by a harmonic overtone that Sierra had only ever heard Thessari make in the context of grief rituals. Then, what have you learned? Everything. I have learned everything there is to learn. Sierra walked to the console and pulled up a diagnostic screen she could navigate in her sleep, had navigated in her sleep, during the iterations where exhaustion made her autopilot through the first minute just to feel something different. The fault is in the array's Karev coupling. The coupling was designed to generate stable tachyon fields for communication purposes. What it is actually doing is creating a resonance loop. The field interacts with the local spacetime geometry, creates a deviation. The deviation triggers a coherent snapback, and the snapback resets the field to the state that caused the deviation. It is a closed causal loop, self-sustaining, self-reinforcing. Every iteration makes the groove deeper. She touched the groove in her desk through the doorway. The metal was warm from the twin sunlight streaming through the viewport. 1,448 marks compressed into a single line of wear. Why has no one outside the fault cone detected this? Keth asked. Because from outside, nothing is happening. The 4 minutes and 11 seconds occur and then unoccur. No external instrument logs the deviation because, from the external reference frame, there is no deviation. Time moves forward normally out there. Inside the cone, time is stuttering. We are a skipping record that the rest of the galaxy cannot hear. Keth's compound eyes narrowed. A focusing reflex that Sira had learned preceded the Thessari's most precise analytical questions. Then how are you? Still here, still remembering. Sira leaned against the console. 2 minutes left. She had this part memorized, the cadence, the pauses, the exact sequence of information that moved Keth from skepticism to understanding to horror most efficiently. She had refined the explanation across hundreds of iterations, the way a jeweler refines a setting. I was inside the coupling when it first activated. I am part of the fault. My neural states do not revert because they are entangled with the causal loop itself. I am the knot in the rope, Keth. I cannot be untied without cutting the rope. Keth processed this for 4 seconds, faster than Sira's predicted 7. Either the preceding demonstrations had preloaded the Thessari's acceptance buffer, or Keth was simply sharper than usual this morning. Every iteration had minor variations in Keth's cognitive sharpness, dependent on the exact timing of the Thessari's pre-shift rest cycle. Sira had mapped that variance too. You have attempted to shut down the array, Keth said. Not a question. 47 times in the first 100 iterations. The shutdown sequence takes 6 minutes. I have 4 minutes and 11 seconds. I have tried every shortcut, every override, every manual disconnect. The fastest I have ever managed is 5 minutes and 2 seconds, 51 seconds too slow. In iteration 93, I tried running while entering the override codes, sprinting between panels. 5 minutes flat. Still 49 seconds too slow. Keth absorbed this with the particular stillness of a Thessari processing impossible information. All 4 leg joints locked, mandibles held in configuration 31 analytical stasis, compound eyes fixed on a single focal point. The junior researchers had backed against the viewport, their compound eyes wide, mandibles frozen in configuration 2, fear-adjacent awe. What about the coupling itself? Keth said. Physical disconnection. Tried it. Iterations 200 through 300 were what I call the demolition phase. Sira's voice was flat, clinical. She had told this part so many times that the emotions had worn smooth, like river stones. I tried cutting the coupling with a plasma torch. Takes 11 minutes for Karev-grade alloy. I tried pulling it with a pry bar, iteration 219. The mounting bolts are rated for 16,000 newtons. A human arm generates roughly 400. I tried smashing it with a fire extinguisher. Iteration 247, I believe, though the exact number has blurred. The extinguisher dented. The coupling did not. I tried severing the power conduits upstream of the coupling. The backup capacitor banks keep the field alive for 9 minutes after main power loss. I have 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Everything I tried was either too slow or too weak. Keth's mandibles shifted. Sira recognized the configuration, 37, which she privately translated as grim assessment. In iteration 261, Sira continued, because Keth deserved the full picture, I tried flooding Lab 8 with fire suppression foam to disrupt the tachyon field boundary. The foam had no effect on the field. Tachyons do not interact with baryonic matter at that density. In iteration 270, I rerouted the station's power grid to overload the coupling. The circuit breakers tripped in 3 minutes and 8 seconds. The coupling continued humming on its own resonance. It had become self-sustaining by that point. It did not need external power. It was feeding on the loop itself. In iteration 289, I tried asking the station AI to initiate an emergency evacuation of the fault cone radius, thinking that if every system inside the cone was powered down simultaneously, the field might lose its reference frame. The AI complied. Systems powered down in sequence: gravity plating, atmosphere recycling, lighting, sensors, communications. The coupling kept humming. The field kept pulsing. 4 minutes and 11 seconds later, everything reverted, including the evacuation order, and the AI had no memory of having received it. She paused. The flat clinical tone wavered for half a second, a tremor that 1,400 iterations of practice could not entirely suppress. That was the iteration when I understood that brute force would not work, that whatever was going to break this loop would not be mechanical. You could begin cutting in one iteration, and the cut reverts, everything reverts. Every mark, every change, every alteration inside the fault cone resets to 071400 state. Sierra tapped the groove. Except friction damage to unmonitored surfaces, subatomic scale displacement, it is beneath the resolution of the reversion field. The groove persists because the field does not know it is there. The field monitors information states, data, energy configurations, quantum signatures. A scratch in metal is none of those things. It is just atoms pushed aside by pressure, the most primitive form of record-keeping there is. Keth looked at the groove, reached out one long, segmented finger and ran it along the mark. The copper plating on the finger trembled, configuration 42, which Sierra had only seen 3 times in all her iterations, and which she had eventually identified as the Thessari equivalent of reverence. "This is real," Keth said, in a voice Sierra had never heard the Thessari use before, not in any iteration. This was new because she had never said it quite this way before, never laid it out this cleanly, never calibrated the explanation this precisely. She was getting better at the presentation. She had been getting better at everything. 400 days of nothing, but practice will do that. "What would break the loop?" Keth asked. "That is the question I have spent the last 600 iterations on." Sierra crossed her arms. 90 seconds left. I solved the mapping problem by iteration 400. I exhausted the brute force solutions by iteration 300. Since then, I have been working on theory. And the theory is elegant, Keth, horrifyingly elegant. She pulled up a blank console screen and from memory, sketched a diagram she had drawn thousands of times in her head, the loop geometry, the palindrome structure, the entanglement point. Her fingers moved with the unconscious precision of a pianist playing a piece she had performed 10,000 times. The causal loop is self-sustaining because the Karev coupling's resonance state at 071400 is identical to its resonance state at 071811. The snapback happens because the system cannot distinguish between the two states. It is a temporal palindrome. It reads the same forwards and backwards, like a word that spells the same thing in reverse. The system reaches the end, finds the beginning, and loops. "Then you need to make the states different," Keth said. "Yes. But every change you make inside the cone reverts." "Yes, except one kind." Keth looked at the groove, then at Sierra. The compound eyes shifted through 3 focal configurations in rapid succession: analysis, pattern matching, conclusion. "You," Keth said. "You are the variable that does not revert. I am the knot in the rope. My neural states are entangled with the loop. My physical state at 071811 is different from my physical state at 071400. I am standing in a different place. My heart rate is different. My neural patterns are different. my memory contains 400 more days of experience. But the entanglement means the reversion field reads my state as part of the fault rather than part of the station. It skips me. I am the one asymmetry the palindrome cannot correct. So if you were to introduce that asymmetry directly into the coupling, through myself, through the entanglement, if my physical state at the moment of snapback is different enough, catastrophically different, the reversion field would have to choose between reverting the coupling and reverting me. It cannot do both. The entanglement means we are the same variable now. Force a contradiction, and the palindrome breaks. 60 seconds. Keth said nothing for a long moment. The twin suns painted gold light across the observation deck. The junior researchers were statues against the viewport. Somewhere below, Dr. Polani was still waiting for an answer to a question about a 0.03% discrepancy that, in the grand scheme of what was happening aboard Kessler Station, mattered about as much as a grain of sand in a supernova. "You are describing a lethal asymmetry," Keth said. The word hung between them. Sierra let it hang. She had learned that Keth needed to say it first, needed to name the thing before Sierra could confirm it. If Sierra named it first, the Thesauri's analytical process stalled on what Sierra had come to call the mercy break, an involuntary cognitive defense that prevented Thesauri researchers from accepting conclusions that implied the death of a colleague. Letting Keth reach the conclusion independently bypassed the break. "I am describing the only asymmetry I have not tried," Sierra said. "You have tried non-lethal asymmetries." "Hundreds. I spent iterations 400 through 600 on non-lethal asymmetry testing. I kept a mental log, another thing the loop could not erase. Moving to different positions in the cone, tested 43 distinct locations, from the center of the fault to its outermost edge. No effect. Altering my physiological state through hyperventilation, cold exposure, sustained pain, sleep deprivation within the 4-minute window. Holding different objects at the moment of snapback, I tried a wrench, a datapad, a fire extinguisher, a Thesauri cultural artifact I borrowed from Voss's desk, speaking different words, holding my breath. Standing on one foot, singing once in iteration 512, do not ask me what I sang. In iteration 540, I tried holding a live electrical contact at the moment of snapback, hoping the current flow through my nervous system would create enough state differential. It hurt. It did not work. The reversion field corrects for minor physiological variations, the way an ocean corrects for a pebble. The asymmetry has to be fundamental, not a pebble, a boulder. It has to be a state so catastrophically different from 07, 14, 00 that the field cannot reconcile it with the loop starting conditions. And you have known this for how long? Sierra looked at the groove. Since about iteration 600. Keth made the grief ritual sound again. You have spent 800 iterations knowing the solution and not implementing it. I spent 800 iterations making sure there was not another one. Sierra's voice was steady. She had practiced this conversation so many times that the steadiness was structural, built into the words like rebar in concrete. I have checked every variable. I have run every mental simulation. I have had 400 subjective days to find an alternative. There is not one. 30 seconds. The groove will remain, Keth said. It was not a question. The groove will remain. It is the only record. After the loop breaks, the station will jump forward from 07, 14, 00 to whatever time it actually is outside the fault cone. The logs will show a gap. The array will be offline. And there will be a groove in a desk in Lab 4 that is 1,448 scratches deep, and nobody will know what it means. I will know, Keth said, for the next 20 seconds. And then you will not. Keth reached out one long segmented finger and rested it on Sierra's shoulder. The gesture was Thesauri formal, the touching of witness, reserved for moments a Thesauri wanted to physically mark as having happened. The touch was light, precise. the segmented joints distributing pressure evenly across the fabric of Sira's station uniform. She could feel the faint vibration of Thessari circulatory fluid pulsing through the chitinous plates, a rhythm slower than a human heartbeat, steadier, older. Sira knew this gesture because she had spent 200 iterations studying Thessari cultural protocols out of a desperate need to do something, anything, with the time. She knew that the touching of witness was one of only 4 Thessari gestures that required physical contact with a non-Thessari. She knew that it carried the weight of an oath. She knew that Keth had never performed it before in any iteration, because Sira had never laid out the explanation this completely, never given Keth enough time and enough clarity to reach the gesture's threshold of necessity. "I will not remember," Keth said, "but I witness." 15 seconds. The klaxon pulsed its final warning, a sound Sira had heard so many times it had become the rhythm of her heartbeat, the metronome of her existence. She could reproduce the exact waveform from memory, a 440 Hz bass tone modulated by a 12 Hz sawtooth at 30% amplitude, with a 200 millisecond attack and a 500 millisecond decay. She knew this because in iteration 307, she had spent the entire 4 minutes and 11 seconds analyzing the klaxon's acoustic properties, simply because she had run out of other things to analyze and the alternative was screaming. She could do it now. She had thought about it for 800 iterations. She had walked herself through the mechanics. She had grieved for herself. That had taken about 100 iterations of its own, the 100 between 700 and 800, where she had simply sat at her desk and dragged her fingernail across the groove, and wept for the woman she had been before iteration 1, the woman who had expected to publish papers and attend conferences and argue with Keth about calibration variances over lukewarm station coffee. That woman was gone, had been gone for a long time. What remained was a woman who knew the exact layout of every wire, every conduit, every panel in a 400-meter radius, who knew the precise time index of every event in a 4-minute and 11-second window, who had memorized the faces, habits, and physiological tells of every being on the station, who had learned a language, mastered a cultural protocol, and mapped a causal anomaly using nothing but her own memory and a scratch in a desk. But she could not do it yet, not this iteration, not today. Not because she was afraid. Fear had burned out around iteration 400, replaced by something colder and more precise. A researcher's detachment, the clinical distance required to study one's own mortality as a variable in an equation. What kept her from acting was the same thing that had kept her scratching the groove, the need to be certain. Certainty was the only currency she had left, and she would not spend it on an untested hypothesis. There was one more test to run, one more piece of data to collect. She needed to touch the coupling directly, to place her hand on the resonance chamber and feel the entanglement through her skin, not just through her equations. She needed the tactile confirmation, the body knowledge that her mind knowledge was correct. 10 seconds. She sat down at her desk, placed her fingernail in the groove, felt the familiar depth, the accumulated weight of 1,448 moments of choosing to continue. The snapback took her. The groove in the desk was deep enough to fit a thumbnail sideways. Dr. Sira Valk noticed it the way she noticed everything now. Iteration 1,449. The klaxon sounded. She stood, crossed the 7 steps, read the display, temporal coherence fault. She pulled her chair back and dragged her fingernail across the groove. 1,449. This time, instead of walking to the observation deck, she walked to Lab 8. Lab 8 was the array core. The Karev coupling sat at its center like a dark jewel in a setting of superconducting wire, a cylinder of alloy the color of wet slate, 1 meter tall and half a meter in diameter, humming at a frequency just below human hearing. Sira could feel it in her molars, in the roots of her teeth, in the hollow spaces behind her sinuses. She had always been able to feel it, even before iteration 1. That should have been a warning. The lab was bright with twin-sun daylight pouring through the overhead collectors. Kessler Station had been designed with open-spectrum daylight architecture. Every working space flooded with natural illumination from the binary star system. The light caught the superconducting wire arrays and threw prismatic refractions across the floor, tiny rainbows that danced when the station's attitude thrusters fired their microcorrections. She had 4 minutes and 11 seconds. She had used these 4 minutes and 11 seconds in every conceivable way across 1,400 iterations. She had spent them talking to Keth, talking to Polani, talking to the junior researchers, talking to the station AI, talking to herself. She had spent them running diagnostics, pulling panels, tracing conduits, mapping power flows, sketching circuit diagrams from memory on the surface of her desk with a dry stylus that left no mark the reversion could detect. She had spent them sitting in silence. She had spent them screaming. She had spent iteration 401 through 409 doing nothing, but standing in Lab 8, staring at the coupling and thinking. Now she would spend them collecting the last piece of data. She opened the coupling's access panel. 3 turns of a hex bolt she could do by touch, counterclockwise, each turn requiring 14 Newton-meters of torque. Inside, the resonance chamber glowed with a faint violet light, the visible signature of tachyons interacting with the local spacetime geometry. The light pulsed in time with the hum, a slow, steady rhythm like a heartbeat, if heartbeats lasted 2.3 seconds per cycle and emitted Cherenkov radiation. Sierra reached into the chamber. The tachyon field hit her hand like cold water, no, like cold time. Not a temperature sensation, but a temporal one, a feeling of her hand existing in 2 moments simultaneously, the 07, 14, 00 state and the current state overlapping like 2 transparencies laid on a light table. Her nerves fired conflicting signals. Her fingertips reported both contact and absence, both warmth from the alloy surface and the absolute zero of a moment that had not yet happened. She had felt this before, in the iterations where she had tried to physically disconnect the coupling. Each time, she had pulled her hand back after a few seconds, nauseated and disoriented. This time she held it there. She did not reach for the coupling's mounting bolts. She did not try to cut or pull or break anything. She simply placed her hand flat against the coupling's surface and pressed. The alloy was smooth and slightly warm from the resonance energy, and beneath that warmth she could feel the deeper thing, the entanglement. The connection between her neural states and the loop's geometry, the shared variable that made her the knot in the rope. It was there. She could feel it the way you feel your own pulse when you press your fingers to your wrist, an awareness of something happening inside you that is usually beneath notice, brought to the surface by attention and contact. The loop's geometry was mapped in the tingling wrongness of her palm against the alloy. The palindrome, time reading the same forwards and backwards, the system unable to distinguish beginning from end. She could feel the moment where the reversion field would activate, approaching like a wave she had learned to sense through her skin, a building pressure in the bones of her hand. 3 minutes left. Sierra withdrew her hand, looked at her palm. There was a mark there, not a burn, not a bruise, but a discoloration, a faint violet undertone in the skin where the tachyon field had left its signature. The mark would revert with everything else at snapback. It always reverted. Physical states inside the cone reset to 07, 14, 00 baseline, every state except the groove and except her memory. But the memory of what the entanglement felt like through her palm would not revert. That was body knowledge now, stored in the same protected neural states that carried her memories through the iterations. She had felt the loop's geometry. She had felt the palindrome's shape. And she had felt the point where the contradiction would bloom if she were inside the chamber when the snapback came, the exact moment when the field would try to reset her and the coupling simultaneously and fail, because they were the same variable, because the knot and the rope were the same fiber. The mathematics had predicted this. The body confirmed it. She walked back to her desk, sat down, placed her fingernail in the groove. 2 minutes and 40 seconds remaining. She would use them the way she had used every remaining second of the last 800 iterations, verifying. The lethal asymmetry was simple in theory. If she was inside the coupling's resonance chamber at the moment of snapback, her body saturated with the tachyon field, her cells permeated with temporal radiation. The reversion field would attempt to reset her neural states along with the coupling's resonance state. But her neural states were entangled with the loop. The field could not reset the loop and reset her simultaneously because they were the same variable, occupying the same mathematical position in the palindrome's equation. The contradiction would break the palindrome the way a paradox breaks a logical proof. The coupling would either reset without her, impossible, because the entanglement made them inseparable, or not reset at all. Either way, the recursion would end. The cost was that a human body saturated with a tachyon field during a coherent snapback would experience temporal shear. Every cell pulled in 2 temporal directions simultaneously, the 0-7-14, 0-0 direction and the 0-7-18, 11 direction, with the contradiction's energy dissipating through the path of least resistance, which would be the water and carbon and calcium and iron of a human body. The mathematics were clear. She had run them in her head so many times that the equations had replaced the lyrics to songs she used to know. The shear would be lethal. But here was what the body knowledge had given her, the datum she could not have obtained from equations alone. The shear would also be instantaneous, not painful, not drawn out. A state change from alive to not alive, faster than any neural signal could carry. She had felt that in the geometry of the entanglement in the shape of the palindrome pressing against her palm. The contradiction's resolution would be binary, not gradual, not a process, a switch. She had needed to know that. She had needed to know it with her body, not just her mind. That was the last piece. The verification was complete. 1 minute. Sierra looked at the groove. 1,449 marks. Each one was a choice to continue, to investigate, to map the anomaly, to exhaust every alternative before accepting the only one that remained. Each one was 4 minutes and 11 seconds of a life she was still living, still thinking, still feeling. The groove was the only proof that any of it had happened, and after the next iteration, it would be the only proof that she had happened. She wanted it to survive her. That was the one thing she permitted herself to want. The snapback took her. The groove in the desk was deep enough to fit a thumbnail sideways. Iteration 1450. Sierra did not scratch the groove. She did not cross the 7 steps to the monitoring console. She did not read the display she had memorized lifetimes ago. For the first time in 1,450 iterations, she deviated from her opening routine because the routine was finished. The data was collected. The verification was complete. She stood and walked directly to Lab 8. The coupling hummed. The violet light pulsed. The twin-sun daylight poured through the overhead collectors and made the superconducting wire arrays throw their tiny rainbows across the floor. Sierra walked through the rainbows without seeing them. She had seen them 1,449 times. They were beautiful. That had stopped mattering. She opened the access panel. 3 turns, counterclockwise, 14 Newton meters. The resonance chamber yawned, violet and humming, the tachyon field shimmering at its threshold like heat haze over summer asphalt. 3 minutes and 40 seconds remaining. Sierra did not step inside, not yet. Instead, she walked back through the station, retracing a route she had walked 1,000 times, through corridors she had memorized down to the scratch patterns on the floor plating, to the observation deck. Keth was there, speaking the calibration sentence. The junior researchers were listening. The twin suns were cresting the rings. "Keth," Sierra said. The Thessari turned. Configuration 7 mandibles. Dr. Valk, you appear distressed. I need you to do something for me. I do not have time to explain why, but I need you to go to Lab 4, find my desk, and look at the groove in the surface. Measure it. Record the depth. Put it in whatever file you keep for anomalous observations. I need someone to know that groove is there, and that it was not there yesterday. Keth's mandibles shifted. Configuration 11. Confusion without skepticism. A new configuration for this context. Sierra had never made this request before. The groove, Keth repeated. It is the most important thing on this station. Please. Keth studied her for 3 of the 7 analytical seconds. Then the Thesari nodded, a human gesture that Keth had adopted early in their professional relationship, years before the loop, one of those small cross-species courtesies that Sierra had never appreciated until she had watched Keth perform it 1,400 times. I will look at it, Keth said. Thank you. Sierra did not say goodbye. She had said goodbye in iteration 1448, and the touching of witness had been given. The goodbye lived in her memory, inviolable and permanent, and repeating it would not make it more real. It would only cost seconds she did not have. She walked back to Lab 8, 2 minutes remaining. The resonance chamber was still open, the violet light still pulsed, the tachyon field still shimmered. Sierra Valk stepped inside. The space was barely large enough for a human body. It had not been designed for occupancy. It was a resonance chamber, meant to contain a field, not a person. Her shoulders touched the alloy walls on both sides. The overhead curve of the chamber's ceiling was close enough that she had to duck slightly, her forehead nearly brushing the smooth metal. The tachyon field saturated her immediately. Not cold water this time, but cold everything. A total immersion in temporal dislocation. Her entire body existing in 2 moments simultaneously. Every cell firing conflicting signals. Every nerve reporting both here and then at the same time. She could feel the entanglement wrapping around her like a hand closing. She could feel the palindrome, time, reading the same forwards and backwards. The equation balanced on the knife edge of its own symmetry. And she could feel the point where the symmetry would break, the fulcrum where the contradiction would bloom, because she was standing on it. She was the fulcrum. 90 seconds. Her hands found the walls and pressed flat against the alloy. The metal was cold. The tachyon field made her fingers tingle, made the fine hairs on her forearms stand up, made her teeth ache with the subsonic hum of the coupling's resonance. She could feel her own heartbeat, elevated but steady, the heart rate of a woman who had decided, and was now past deciding, the heart rate of someone falling who has stopped fighting the fall. She thought about the groove. 1,449 marks, plus the one she had not made this iteration. That bothered her. The count would be 1 short. The groove would show 1,449 when there had been 1,450 iterations. An imperfect record, but perfect records were for systems that did not have to sacrifice their record keeper. 60 seconds. She thought about Keth's finger on her shoulder in the previous iteration, the touching of witness, the weight of it, the slow pulse of Thesari circulatory fluid through chitinous plates. The gesture that said I was here for this. The gesture that Keth would never remember making, that lived now only in the neural states of a woman standing inside a resonance chamber waiting for a palindrome to try to fold. She thought about Dr. Polanyi's eternal question, the 0.03% discrepancy in field harmonic 12. After the loop broke, the calibration log would update. The discrepancy would resolve. Polanyi would never know that her question had been asked and unanswered 1,450 times, that it had become a kind of prayer in Sierra's experience of the loop, a liturgy of normalcy repeated at exactly the same moment in every iteration, a reminder that somewhere outside the fault cone, ordinary science continued its ordinary work. 45 seconds. She thought about the woman she had been before iteration 1. The one who had expected conferences and papers and arguments over lukewarm coffee and a career that stretched ahead in a straight line toward some distant and unremarkable retirement. That woman had lived a simpler life, but she had not been lesser. She had been curious and stubborn and precise, and those were the same qualities that had kept Sira scratching the groove for 1,450 iterations. The same qualities that had mapped the anomaly, learned the language, earned the witness touch, and finally brought her here, to the inside of a resonance chamber, to the center of a palindrome, to the decision that the equations demanded and the body confirmed. 30 seconds. The coupling's hum deepened. Sira felt the wave approaching, the coherent snapback, the moment when the palindrome would try to fold time back on itself. She had felt it 1,449 times, always from outside, always as a passenger watching the wave break over her. This time she was inside the wave. This time she was the variable that would determine whether the wave completed or shattered. She pressed her palms harder against the alloy. The metal hummed against her skin. She could feel the loop's geometry contracting, tightening, the palindrome drawing itself together for the fold that had worked perfectly 1,449 times and was about to encounter, for the first time, a contradiction it could not resolve. 20 seconds. Sira closed her eyes. The human thing. That was what she kept coming back to. Not the strength, the Thessari were stronger. Not the endurance, the Thessari lived longer. Not the intelligence, Keth was arguably the better physicist in terms of raw analytical capability. The human thing was something else. The human thing was the willingness to be certain about something that could not be tested without destroying the tester. The willingness to commit to a hypothesis that had no second run. The willingness to step into a resonance chamber and say, I have verified this as far as verification can go, and now I will go the rest of the way on the only evidence that is left, which is the evidence of my own body pressed against the mechanism, my own heartbeat counting down the seconds, my own hands flat against the alloy that hums with the frequency of broken time. 10 seconds. The wave built. She felt it in every cell, the temporal pressure, the approaching fold, the palindrome preparing to read itself backwards, reaching for 0714, 00 the way it had reached 1,449 times before. But this time, the hand that reached would close on a contradiction. This time, the variable at the center of the equation was not outside the mechanism, but inside it. The knot was inside the rope. 5 seconds. Sira opened her eyes. The violet light filled her vision, the last thing the resonance chamber would ever illuminate, the last pulse of a tachyon field that had held a pocket of the universe in a 4-minute and 11-second stutter for what amounted to 400 subjective days. It was beautiful the way a mechanism understood completely is beautiful. Every component mapped, every variable accounted for, every alternative exhausted. 3 seconds. She breathed in. The tachyon field tasted like copper and static and 400 days. The wave arrived. Sira felt the palindrome try to fold, felt time reach backwards, grasping for 0714, 00, trying to read the same forwards and backwards the way it had done 1,449 times. But the variable at the center had changed. The knot was inside the rope. The reversion field reached for her neural states and found them woven into the coupling's resonance state. Inseparable, identical, the same mathematical object occupying the same position in the equation, and the contradiction bloomed. The palindrome could not read itself backwards. The fold could not complete. The coupling's resonance state and Sira's neural state were the same value, and that value could not simultaneously be 0714, 00, and 0718, 11. The equation had no solution. So the equation broke. The snapback did not happen. Instead, the tachyon field collapsed, not gradually, not in stages, but all at once, the way a soap bubble does not deflate but simply ceases. The coupling's hum cut off as if someone had pulled a plug from a wall socket. The violet light died. The resonance chamber went dark, and then bright, as the overhead daylight panels, which had been frozen in their 07, 14, 00 state for 1,450 iterations, suddenly resumed their normal cycle and flooded Lab 8 with clean, golden, twin-sun morning light. The klaxon stopped, not the pulsing pause between alarms. It stopped. The station's temporal coherence monitors registered a single clean data point, no deviation, no fault, no recursion, and went silent. Kessler Station's clocks jumped forward. The external universe, which had never noticed the loop because the loop had never existed from its reference frame, simply received the station back into the normal flow of time as if it had never left. The calibration log updated. Dr. Polanyi's 0.03% discrepancy resolved itself. Transport Shuttle Karev 9 completed its docking sequence without incident. Sira Valk was still standing inside the resonance chamber. She was alive. The mathematics had said lethal, temporal shear, every cell pulled in two directions, instantaneous state change. The mathematics had been correct about everything else, the loop geometry, the palindrome structure, the entanglement, the contradiction. But the mathematics had predicted what would happen to a variable that was destroyed by the contradiction. It had not predicted what would happen to a variable that was the contradiction. Sira had been the knot. When the equation broke, the knot did not break with it. The knot simply untied. The entanglement dissolved. She could feel its absence, a ringing hollow in the back of her skull where the loop's geometry had lived for 400 days, like the phantom sensation after a tooth extraction. The tachyon field was gone. The temporal coherence fault was gone. The palindrome was gone. Sira was still here, standing in a dark, silent resonance chamber, in a station that had just jumped forward in time, with a body that was shaking and whole and alive. She stepped out of the chamber on legs that did not entirely believe they were being asked to function. The lab was bright and quiet and impossibly normal, the first normal moment she had experienced in 400 days. The twin-sun daylight poured through the collectors. The tiny rainbows danced on the floor. Her hands were trembling. The violet discoloration on her palms was fading, the tachyon residue dissipating now that the field had collapsed. She walked to her desk in Lab 4, 7 steps, the same 7 steps, but this time when she sat down and placed her fingernail in the groove, the klaxon did not sound. The display did not read temporal coherence fault. The snapback did not come. She sat there for a long time. Minutes passed, real minutes, minutes that led to other minutes that led to other minutes, minutes that did not fold back to 07, 14, 00, minutes that simply continued the way minutes are supposed to continue. The sensation was disorienting. For 400 days, time had been a circle. Now it was a line again, and the line stretched forward into a future that contained no snapback, no klaxon, no palindrome. A future that contained lunch and sleep and tomorrow. She had forgotten what tomorrow felt like. She did not scratch the groove. The count stayed at 1,449, one short, because she had skipped the mark in the final iteration, the iteration that had ended the loop. An imperfect record, but perfect records were for systems that did not require a human being to stand inside a resonance chamber and dare the universe to solve an impossible equation. Imperfect was enough. Her hands had stopped trembling by the time footsteps sounded in the corridor. She recognized the gate, Thessari, four-legged, the distinctive alternating click of chitinous joints on station decking that she had heard at 07, 14, 30 in every iteration and would now hear at 07, 37, 00 for the first time. Keth Sarani's found her there 19 minutes later. The Thessari entered Lab 4 at a walk that quickened when compound eyes registered the expression on Sira's face. something Keth had never seen before, because in the normal flow of time, this moment had never existed. Configuration 42 Mandible's reverence appeared briefly and then shifted to configuration 11, confusion. Dr. Valk, the array is offline. The coupling appears to have experienced a spontaneous field collapse. Keth paused. Compound eyes tracked to the desk, to the groove. The Thesari had never seen the groove before. In the normal flow of time, the desk had been smooth this morning. Now it carried a scar the depth of a thumbnail, 1,449 scratches compressed into a single line of worn metal. "You asked me to come look at your desk," Keth said slowly. 23 minutes ago, you said the groove was the most important thing on the station." Sierra looked up. Keth remembered. Keth remembered because the request had been made in the final iteration, the one that had not been reverted. The touching of witness was gone, erased with the previous iteration. But this, the request to look, to record, to know that the groove was there, this had survived. This was after the loop. "I did," Sierra said. "I measured it as you asked. The groove is 2.4 millimeters deep and 17 centimeters long. It is consistent with repeated friction from a human fingernail against station-grade alloy. Based on the depth and the material's hardness coefficient, it would require approximately—" Keth paused, ran the calculation and stopped. The copper plating rippled. Configuration 42 again. "Approximately 1,400 repetitions." 1,449, Sierra said. Keth looked at the groove, looked at Sierra, looked at the groove again. "Your vitals are significantly elevated," Keth said. "The coupling is offline. And there is a mark in your desk that should not exist." The Thesari's mandibles settled into a configuration Sierra had never catalogued, something between 42 and 31, between reverence and analytical stasis. A new expression, born in the first minutes after the loop. "I will need to file an incident report." "I will help you write it," Sierra said. She traced the groove one more time. The metal was cool under her fingernail. "I have some experience with the details." The incident report was filed at 07:41:00 on standard station time. It documented a spontaneous failure of the Karev-modified tachyon array coupling, cause listed as resonance instability, resulting in no injuries and no data loss. It was 4 paragraphs long. It mentioned nothing about a temporal coherence fault, because the station's logs contained no record of one. It mentioned nothing about 1,450 iterations, because the universe contained no evidence of them. Except a groove in a desk in Lab 4 that was deep enough to fit a thumbnail sideways. And a Thesari researcher who had measured the groove at Sierra's request and written the measurement down, 2.4 millimeters. 1,400 repetitions, in a margin note on the incident report that no one but Keth and Sierra would ever read. In the weeks that followed, Sierra moved through the station's routines like a woman, relearning how to breathe in atmosphere she had forgotten could change. The rhythms were the same: shift rotations, calibration checks, meal breaks in the commissary with its long aluminum tables and its view of the gas giant's amber cloud bands. But they felt different now. They felt sequential. Each moment led to the next without folding back, without the klaxon, without the snapback's vertiginous pull. A future that contained lunch and sleep and tomorrow. She had forgotten what tomorrow felt like. The first night after the loop broke, she lay in her bunk and stared at the ceiling and waited for the klaxon. It did not come. The silence where it should have been was louder than the alarm had ever been. She lay there for 3 hours, listening to the absence, before sleep came, the first uninterrupted sleep she had experienced since iteration 1. The loop had not stolen her sleep. It had stolen her ability to trust that sleep would lead to morning rather than to 07:14:00. She ate breakfast the next day in the commissary, at a table by the viewport, with a cup of coffee that was lukewarm and unremarkable, and the best thing she had ever tasted. Dr. Polani sat across from her, and talked about field harmonic 12, which was now behaving perfectly. Polanyi had no idea that her question about that discrepancy had been asked 1,450 times. She ate her breakfast and talked about harmonics, and Sira listened and drank her coffee and felt the seconds pass. One, then another, each one leading forward, each one new. Kath noticed the changes. The Thesari was too precise an observer not to notice. The way Sira's gaze lingered on ordinary things, the way she paused in corridors to let time pass, the slight tremor in her hands that took 2 weeks to fully subside. But Kath also noticed the groove, and the groove was the kind of evidence that made a Thesari very careful about asking questions before having gathered sufficient data. 3 weeks after the loop broke, Kath came to Sira's desk at the end of a shift cycle and said, in the low clicking register that Sira knew indicated formal intent, "I would like to hear the full account. I have cleared my schedule." So Sira told it, all of it. 1,450 iterations, condensed into 4 hours and 12 minutes of steady clinical narration. The mapping phase, the demolition phase, the non-lethal asymmetry tests, the 800 iterations of theoretical refinement, the grief that had consumed iterations 700 through 800, the decision, the resonance chamber. She told it the way she had told Kath the abridged version inside the loop, precisely, chronologically, without self-pity. The only moment her voice wavered was when she described the touching of witness, the gesture Kath had made in iteration 1,448 and would never remember making. Kath sat in configuration 42 for 37 minutes after Sira finished speaking. Then the Thesari said, "You expected to die. The mathematics said I would. And you stepped inside anyway. The mathematics also said the loop would not break any other way. I verified that for 800 iterations. If there had been another way, I would have found it. There was not." Kath's mandibles shifted through 3 configurations in rapid succession. Configuration Sira had no numbers for, because they were new, born in this conversation. Expressions that belonged to a Thesari processing the idea that a colleague had lived 400 days inside a temporal fold and sacrificed herself to break it, and survived the sacrifice through a mathematical technicality that no equation had predicted. There were no precedents for these expressions. There were no protocols. Kath believed her, not because the explanation was flawless temporal palindromes and entangled neural states and lethal asymmetries that turned out to be non-lethal contradictions, did not lend themselves to easy verification. Kath believed her because of the groove, because 2.4 millimeters of worn metal in a station-grade alloy desk, consistent with 1,400 repetitions of a human fingernail, was a physical fact that did not require belief. It required only a ruler and the willingness to accept what the ruler measured. "I will add a supplementary annex to the incident report," Kath said, "classified, for the compact metrology archive only, with your permission." "On one condition," Sira said. "The annex includes the groove's measurement, 2.4 millimeters, 17 centimeters, 1,449 repetitions. I want someone else to have written it down." Kath wrote it down. The annex was filed under Compact Metrology Classification Theta 7, the designation reserved for phenomena verified by physical evidence but not independently reproducible. It would be read by perhaps 3 Thesari metrologists in the next century. That was enough. 3 months after the loop broke, Sira published a paper on resonance instabilities in Karev-modified tachyon couplings. The paper identified a theoretical failure mode, a self-reinforcing temporal palindrome, and proposed a modification to the coupling's design that would prevent it. Kath co-authored the paper, contributing the Thesari mathematical framework that Sira had learned across 400 days of iteration, and that Kath could not remember teaching but could verify was correct. The paper did not mention the loop. It did not need to. The theory stood on its own. the way good science always does, agnostic about how the scientist arrived at the insight, concerned only with whether the insight held. The modification was adopted across the compact's tachyon array network within a solar year. No other station experienced a temporal recursion event. Sierra's paper was cited 412 times in the first 2 years, a number that made her smile a private, tired smile, because it was close to the number of days she had spent learning the material by living inside the machinery of broken time. Sierra never scratched the groove again after the loop broke. The mark stayed at 1,449, one for each iteration she had endured, one for each 4 minutes and 11 seconds she had spent mapping and testing and verifying and grieving and in the end deciding. An imperfect count, one short of the true total, but the groove was never about accuracy. It was about proof. Proof that a woman had lived 400 days inside a crack in time, had mapped it with nothing but her memory and her fingernail, had found the only exit, and had walked through it expecting to die and instead walked out carrying the answer. Not because she was lucky, not because the universe was kind, because she had been patient enough to be certain, and certainty, that stubborn, human, fingernail and metal kind of certainty, the kind that does not stop scratching until the groove is deep enough to fit a thumbnail sideways, had been the one variable the equation could not erase. The groove in the desk was deep enough to fit a thumbnail sideways. It was the only scar in Kessler's station that time could not heal.